All right, so today is going to be just a little bit different. We're going to talk about how components can affect your ride quality. So from heavy duty components that are designed to take a beating, all the way to lightweight components that make the scale happy, we've got a good little showdown brewing. Here's how it's all going to work. I've got a 2024 Orbea Rise. So this bike is a pretty versatile little platform that can go from being very trail to very all mountain, depending on how you build it up. And then when you consider you've got Orbea's Myo program that lets you basically build a custom bike straight from the factory. You can pick paint colors, logos, wheels, tires, suspension, really anything you want on this bike you can customize, and it's all at no extra charge. That does make this specific bike a very versatile platform, and it makes it the perfect test rig for doing this. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of a DIY-o. We're going to build this bike up two ways. We're going to go lightweight and then we're going to go burly. Worth mentioning, both of these are pretty blingy builds, so even the burly one is going to be fairly lightweight considering it's a pretty burly build. We do have the Okuo carbon wheels, we've got an XTR drivetrain, we've got factory suspension everything, XTR brakes, we've got a carbon cockpit. And even though all of these parts are fairly lightweight, these are still designed for the intended application, which is a 140 millimeter travel e-bike. All right, so for my burly build, I've got it with a Fox 36 with 150 millimeters of travel. I've got a Float X shock. I have swapped the tires for a set of Maxxis Minion DHFs, both front and back. That has an EXO Plus casing, and the rear tire does have a Tannis tire insert. And I will be using the same Shimano XTR drivetrain and brakes for both of these builds. You don't really get a drivetrain that's much better or more suited to one application or the other. Keep in mind, both of these builds are still in the trail and all mountain categories where this bike sits. For my lightweight build, I'll be swapping the Fox 36 for a 140 mil travel Fox 34. I also have a Fox Float DPS that I'll be using instead of the burlier Float X. Obviously the dampers are a little bit different, and that also applies to the forks as well, but I've done my best to set them up similarly, or at least how they should be set up for their application. I will be changing out the tires, and I'll be using a set of Maxxis Recons, both front and back. These are EXO casings with no tire inserts, so a little bit dangerous. And before you come at me and say I didn't change the right components or I could have gone lighter, you are absolutely right. I could have definitely gone lighter. I am not here to make the lightest bike possible or the heaviest bike possible. I am here to make two very realistic builds within the intended application of this bike. One on the more trail side, one on the more all mountain side. And personally, I don't want to ride this thing with two piston brakes and tiny little brake rotors. That doesn't sound interesting to me at all. That said, my lightweight build is pretty lightweight for an e-bike in this category. And actually, before we go, it's worth noting this is not a how much money did you spend on your components showdown. This is a light versus burly showdown. I didn't want to make it high-end versus cheap. So there's a pretty substantial weight difference between these two builds, with the bulk of it coming from the tires. That means there's a pretty big difference in rotational weight. And rotational weight can feel quite a bit heavier than non-rotational weight. And really, all of this is to say that the burly build rides quite a bit heavier than the lightweight build, even though the actual number on the scale isn't that big. So weight on an e-bike doesn't equate so much to climbing speed as it does range. On a pedal bike, it's definitely your speed and your range, but on an e-bike, it's mostly just your range. We'll get into that more later. That extra weight on the burlier build isn't only noticeable on the climbs. You notice that extra weight on the descents in a couple of ways. First, the bike is physically harder to get off the ground when bunny hopping, on wading, getting over obstacles. You'll also feel a bit of that extra weight when leaning the bike over in the corners. Remember, some of this weight is rotational weight in the form of tires and inserts, and that's going to make the wheels want to stay going in the direction they're going rather than leaning or turning. That's physics or something. That added weight isn't all negative though. It does help with a little bit of stability both on the ground and in the air. Also, the heavier components do add a bit to the durability of the bike. It's not that they're heavier, it's that they're built more durable, and in turn that makes them heavier. So like we were talking about earlier, we're going to get into the range part of it now. E-bike range comes down to a lot of different factors, including battery capacity, motor output, rider weight, bike weight, tire weight, tire tread, the color of the jersey you're wearing, where Jupiter's moons are in their orbits. You get the idea. There are definitely measurable impacts on the Rise's range though between these two builds. So if we're looking at this, we got a nice tiny little fast rolling knob on this Recon. The Minion gets quite a bit bigger and slower rolling in addition to the extra weight. I think that's the biggest impact on the Rise's range. In all of our testing we've done, we've hit about 2,500 to 2,700 vertical feet of elevation gain per battery with a 200-pound rider on full boost. That's on the Burly build. On the lightweight build, we're getting a little bit closer to 2,800, 2,900 under those same conditions. That does mean you're getting a little bit more vertical gain per watt hour of battery on the lightweight build. Again, your mileage may vary though. See, I'm wearing a green shirt right now. If you're wearing a red shirt, you might not get the same range. So here's where things start to get really fun. Now we're going to talk about the capability, and the capability difference between these two builds is maybe the most stark difference. The lightweight build feels much more trail, while the Burly build feels a lot more all mountain. So let's talk about what's different, and we're going to start with the Burly build. The bike feels much more stable, capable, and controlled. And I would imagine the tires do the lion's share of that. They not only provide a bit more cushion, but they also offer more traction as well as durability. You can slam into rocks at higher speeds with much less regard for your rims. The big Burly fork, I think, is a contributor as well, especially for me. I'm pretty tall, getting close to 200 pounds. I appreciate the thicker 36 mil diameter fork. There is a noticeable difference in the amount of flex that you get out of this one, especially in rough, bumpy corners, in steep sections of trail where your weight is pretty far over the front of the bike. You notice a lot less flex, which in turn gives you more control over the front end and a bit more stability. And that's not even to mention that this fork is a 150 mil travel fork instead of the stock 140 mil travel fork on our lightweight bike. So that extra 10 millimeters of travel is going to make that head tube angle about a ½ degree slacker, which does all of those things: more stability, more control, better on the steeps. And it does make your wheelbase just a little bit longer. So the bike just rides and feels a little bit bigger. So now let's talk about how the shock itself impacted the capability. I don't think the Burly or Float X made that big of an impact on the ride quality. Sure, it has more volume, which will make it a little better off the top. It'll help it in a couple of other aspects as well. But I think that off the top sensitivity may have been masked by the tires. It is not all cherries on top though with the Burlier build. There are some drawbacks. This build does take a little bit more of a heavy-handed approach to handling, to cornering, to bunny hopping. It takes a little bit more effort, and it's maybe a little bit more of a wrestling match than the lightweight build. The lightweight bike, on the other hand, is a much more mild-mannered ride. It feels quicker, snappier, and more responsive. Again, I think a lot of that comes from the tires and the reduction in rolling weight and resistance. It makes the bike incredibly fun in that fast, smooth, rolling terrain, but that lively character does come at a cost. The bike offers much less traction and control than the Burly version, especially in loose conditions. And the risk of getting a flat goes way up. You put two paper-thin EXO casing tires on this thing, and it's still a 40-pound e-bike with 140 millimeters of travel. It wants to go pretty fast, and those tires aren't going to last. Going back to the fork, with that 34 mil stanchion fork, there is quite a bit more flex, especially in that rough and bumpy, steep terrain where your weight is more over the front of the bike. So there are pros and cons to each of these builds when it comes to handling. The lightweight build is really good in the corners, and it makes it easier to lean it over and to get around a corner. The front end is a little bit steeper, the wheelbase is shorter, and that makes the handling feel a bit more responsive. But it also has a little bit less grip at the tires and a bit flexier front end that can make rough, loose, and steep corners harder to manage. On the other hand, the Burly build handles those difficult corners much better because it offers a bit more traction and control, but where it pays the price is on those tighter corners. And now let's talk about the fun factor or the lively factor. This one's a little bit tough to define or differentiate because what's fun for me might not be fun for you. If your definition of fun is hucking off of everything in sight regardless of the landing, you might enjoy the Burly build, as it's going to be a bit more confident and forgiving. But if your version of fun is hitting perfectly manicured lips, smooth corners, zigzagging from one side of the trail to the other, you might prefer the lightweight build as it's easier to move around and get off the ground. Let's talk about which component had the biggest impact on the ride quality. And this is not going to be perfect because I made multiple changes at once, which I know is bad science, but this is biking, so it's not really that scientific anyway. If I had to pinpoint the one component that I think made the biggest difference to the bike's ride quality, I would have to say it's the tires and inserts. It had a big effect on almost every aspect of the ride quality, from weight and range to capability and handling. And that should give you a bit of hope because tires are relatively easy to change, and compared to forks and drivetrains and other parts, they're pretty cheap. So if your bike doesn't ride exactly how you want it, tires might be the first place to start. And I think bang for your buck, they make the biggest impact to your ride quality. All right, so which one would I pick? I think I'd have to go with the Burly build because it aligns better with how I like to ride a bike. I like rough, rocky, loose terrain more than I do smooth, fast, flowy, bermy terrain. I also really hate flat tires because nothing ruins your ride faster than a flat. And I like the added durability from that heavier weight tire. I'm willing to pay the penalty for that too, because every time I ride a lightweight EXO casing, I pretty much am guaranteed to get a flat. And that's just no fun. So I would take the Burly build. I can appreciate the lively, quicker, snappier, more responsive nature of the lightweight build though. Well, that's gonna do it. I am curious to see how you'd build this up or what you would change to impact your ride quality. So let me know below, and thanks for sticking around. See you next time.